Okay, so hello everyone. Welcome to Clark Art Talks. I'm Kendra Larson. I am the Archer Gallery Director and Clark Art Talks Director. Um, uh, we are very lucky to have artist Amy Turnbull with us today. So Amy's work explores complexities of visual perception in our digital era. Seeing is a dance between bottom-up and top-down mental processing. Our eyes take in intricate arrays, and our brains use pre-existing schema to direct how we see. The self is viewed through a flexing mirror. Ultimately, humans are meaning makers and pattern seekers, striving to create order and connection from ocular flow. And I'll just add that I've had the joy of knowing and working with Amy for about 8 years now at Lewis and Clark. And so I think of her as a friend and a colleague, and I am really excited to hear her artist talk.
Excellent. Well, thank you guys so much for joining me today. I'm excited to kind of tell you a little bit what I've been doing and thinking about. So I'm Amy Turnbull. I'm an artist. I'm a member of Blackfish Gallery in Portland, and I'm also a faculty member at Lewis and Clark College in the Graduate School of Education. And my job there is to train people who are becoming middle school and high school art teachers. So I thought today I would talk to you a little bit about my development as an artist and also my development as a teacher, since those things are somewhat intertwined for me. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. Okay. Okay, so the first body of work that I'm going to show you is called Portraits of Perception. This comes out of work that I started when I was getting my MFA at the Oregon College of Art and Craft. And at that time, I had this piece of reflective foil in my studio, and it was sort of like a funhouse mirror. But I had these kind of like, it gave me these like warpy self-reflections. And I became really interested in trying to process the information from these distorted reflections. So this made me think about the internet and how what we know is shifting and warping and changing as a result of our technology. This one is called Approach and Avoid Systems Exposed. And I was in my studio taking photographs when I turned the camera around so that the screen showed up in the image. And as I moved slightly in this warped mirror, these two separate images of my face joined together into one kind of like Cyclops version. And I captured this sequence of photos. And then later, after my MFA, I decided to paint those as a series of works. This one is called Obscuring and Elaborating. And there's this tension that runs in my artwork between sort of like acknowledging discordance and wanting to create cohesion. So according to the psychologist Jacques Lacan, when a baby looks into a mirror, like her fragmented sense of self coalesces into like this unified vision of like an eye. But my mirror seems like it works in the reverse. So in my warpy mirror, my reflection comes back more fractured and distorted by shifting contexts. And then on top of this surface, I try to create a more predictable layer, just like we use social media to enhance certain perceptions of ourselves and then tone back other things. And you can kind of see these faces have like started to squish. This one is actually the part where they're like most squished. So it's all become sort of like the eyes have reduced down to one. This one's called Self as a Slippery Construction. So in contemporary times, postmodern theories deconstructed this idea of like a coherent, unified self. And the self is often a like more fragmented cultural construction that's pieced together around identity markers like race and class and gender and age and sexuality. And when I look at my reflection in this like crinkled, pitted reflective wrapping paper, I see multiple like fragmented parts of my face, and the images shift every time I move, and they're kind of hard to hold on to. So for me, it's like these changing faces suggest that I can't really see myself clearly, or the aspects of my identity shift as I move through my roles, my daily roles as like an artist and a teacher and a parent. This one's called Going Viral. I made this one during the pandemic, And I was, this is kind of like as I was figuring out how to do these ripple patterns. I'm showing you them backwards, the series, like the beginning ones are the ones that I did last, and we're moving like to the ones that I did earlier. So I was kind of interested in like the ways that these lines multiply and sort of spread, and it made me think about like disease vectors. This one is called multiple hits. So just thinking about the age of the selfie and how we all use our phone to craft and distribute these specific representations of our identities, always trying to attract more attention. This one is called Select Amplify Broadcast. And my paintings really have two parts. Like the underlayers contain these sort of like warpy portraits, but then the top layers have patterns that are made out of arrays of lines. And when I'm painting with patterns, I try to capture like how my mind works to create order and understanding in a world that might not contain either. So the surface patterns are more like the mental categories and the thinking structures that we use to help us like censor and select and organize. And, as humans, I feel like we need to make meaning from this bombardment of sensory experiences that we encounter throughout the day. So kind of thinking about like patterning has been my way to do that. This one is called Approach and Avoid. It's instinctual to want to approach the things that give us pleasure and avoid things that cause pain. And, as we use our phones as the media for relating to others, sometimes these categories get confused. So what's compelling might also be causing harm. And I thought of that for this one because I feel like the color harmonies are like a little bit harsh and discordant. And so that sort of worked for me. This one is called Pre-Existing Schema. In this one, the surface pattern is so dominant that you actually have to kind of like look hard to see, like there is an eye on the left that's closed and there is a center eye, and you can see the back of the face. And if you could like look at the bottom carefully, you can still see those phones that are reflected. But that blue pattern for me like really comes forward. And so, the face starts to disappear more. Which made me think about how our pre-existing schema sometimes like cover up like the things that we might otherwise see. This one is called Seeing and Coalescing. And I've been super interested in neurology ever since I got my MFA. So our neural systems process these lines in interesting ways. We group lines of similar value and similar color into shapes. And this makes some areas dominant while others recede. And so then in this one, it's like you kind of have to intentionally look for the phones, because otherwise those sort of more like pupil shapes really stand out more. This one's called Flexing Mirror. I experience the nature of identity and consciousness, but I want to bring the strands together and sew them up into a unified sense of self. And so I feel like, I don't know, my painting is sort of like a personal coping strategy for our time. This one is called Personal Array. And the psychologist David McRaney writes that in our inability to see ourselves clearly in relation to the world, we tend to look for confirmation of what we already know. This can help us move forward to try things in the face of adversity. As humans, we selectively edit and filter to create a sense of cohesion. This helps us to identify priorities and values and to make decisions as we move through the world. So it's like both a coping strategy, and it has its limitations in terms of like, it limits the things that you can see. Some of the early versions of these paintings were just in black and white. This is something from my MFA. And there are actually two types of ganglion cells in the retina that process information from the rods and cones in our eyes in different ways. So the large ganglion cells are colorblind, but they're really highly sensitive to contrast and value, and they transmit information more quickly, but that information is less acute. And then I started to add colors on top of these paintings, kind of thinking about the relationship between value and color. And And it's sort of interesting because like the small ganglion cells in our retina evolved a little bit later, and they are less sensitive to value contrast, but they carry more information about color. And they don't transmit information as quickly. And then I started adding sort of these lined patterns on the top layer. And for me, they really represent our schema or thought patterns that we use to make sense of what we see. So I thought I would backtrack a little bit. I remember when I was in college that I was really hungry to understand like how people structure their lives as artists, like how do they support themselves, how do they structure their time, how do they balance all the other parts of their lives. So I thought I would try to address a few of these topics today. This is probably the first piece that I made that really made me feel like art has the potential for me. I was about 23. I was not an art major in college. I was an anthropology major. So this was my junior year of college, and I was nearing graduation and kind of like uncertain about like what I wanted in my future. And I took a summer workshop at Anderson Ranch Art Center in Colorado called Story Cabinets. And I made this little like book slash box that brought together all these different parts of my life. So, you know, it has, I'll show you a photo. It has some like woven photos, and it has some collage, and it has text. And it was just this very like sort of integrating synthesis experience that was powerful for me. And it made me decide that I want to become an artist. So after college, I worked for a little while for a potter in Colorado. And then I moved to Portland, and I started taking classes at the Oregon College of Art and Craft, which I love that place. And I was really interested in, you know, patterning in ceramics. And these are teapots, one with a more sort of like controlled geometric design and one with looser organic shapes. I made this Tin Man inspired teapot that's a combination of hand building and wheel thrown parts. This is my first coil thrown vase that's about 3 feet tall, where you like throw as much clay on the wheel as you can. You let that get to leather hard. You add a coil of fresh clay, you throw that on the wheel, you let it all set up to leather hard, and you just kind of keep building. So that was a neat technique for learning how to build bigger. This sculpture that I made there was for my dad. My parents are cattle ranchers in Colorado. My family's lived in the same town for 4 generations. And this was a grass goddess for my dad, who worked really hard irrigating his fields to grow enough grass for the cattle. And the land there was under a lot of development pressure. So you can see like the shovel down at the bottom actually kind of becomes a cul-de-sac that's like a little suburban housing development with all these little houses. There's a detail of that one. This one was more about like relinquishing control around age and death. There's this tiny little fetal figure. You can't really see it, but it's like in the middle of that bulb. And I didn't fire this sculpture, but I took it outside in the greenware stage, and I let the rain sort of like slowly break it down, and I just photographed it as it started to crack and then eventually disintegrated. And then the figure in the center fell sort of like boom, right down the center, and it was sort of like falling down the stem into the underworld. So I made the photographs into a book, and the book basically has 2 structures. It can be linear or it can be circular, which makes me think about sort of like how we experience like a life and time as something that is linear, but maybe could also be circular. This is another piece from that time at OCAC called Cosmology, where I was really thinking about the folding of time and space. So each one of these little books, each one of these little semicircles is actually a book, and they open up to create these little globes that have text from the physicist David Bohm about the folding of space and time. And then it makes an installation where they like hung as sculptures in front of this larger panel that was prints of us from like kind of a similar pattern. At this point, I decided to become a high school art teacher as a more reliable way to support myself. So I've been working, kind of getting by as a nanny and working in a paint your own pottery store, but I really needed something that was more reliable and secure with health insurance. So I enrolled in the MAT program at Lewis and Clark College, which is the same program that I teach in now. Lewis and Clark has beautiful gardens, and I was lucky enough to take a class in those gardens that was a drawing class. And we looked at the artwork in that class of Jennifer Bartlett. And this body of work has kind of a funny story. Like, Jennifer Bartlett had rented a house in France, and it rained during the entire length of her stay. And so she really just had like one view out of her window that was this reflective pool. And she set herself up with a challenge to draw this one view in as many different styles as she could, really ranging from representational to formal to almost completely abstract. And in this class that I took, we did kind of a similar thing where we were in the garden and we just like started experimenting with all these styles. And that class had a big impact on me in terms of like just helping me develop this love of like a series. So like, how can you take one idea and just work with it and expand it over time? So at the end of that year, I got a job at Hillsborough High School where I taught Art 1 and ceramics. I really loved that job. And it did take me a few years to kind of like, for the first few years, my art making was much more like around the samples that I was making with my students. But then eventually I got more like back into my own studio habits of making art as well. And this one is a drawing of zucchini plants in my garden at that time. My next body of work was more around like religions and tide pools. So I was really interested in water as a symbol for the unconscious, and thinking, wouldn't it be nice if world religions could coexist in the same way that multiple types of organisms live together in a tide pool? And so I actually made all of these little like clay figures that were sculptures, and I put a strong light source on them and photographed them, and then did a whole series of drawings from those images. So I just have a couple of those there. And then I started a series around sort of like houseplants and birds, where the idea was like roots and wings. And I had this pair of sculptural birds that had belonged to my grandparents. And I was thinking about my family in terms of roots and wings, and also how to help provide that feeling of like groundedness and possibility for my students. This one, again, like sort of playing with those ideas of overlapping, where it's like the seed pods in the houses, kind of like they sort of coexist in the same like planar space. This is another one of birds that's a little more spiky. This one was sort of the idea of like anchoring. I was thinking a lot about my grandmother on that one. This one's a little more ghostly. It's sort of like the house plants after a storm and the birds are flying off in the distance. And some of them are really just more like mark making and patterning and layering, and this idea of like figure ground relationships. So during that time, I got married, I had twins. And then after a few years, I decided to go back to get an MFA. So I went back to the Oregon College of Art and Craft, where I had studied before. And when I first started my program, the librarian found me this book, The Age of Insight by Eric Kendall. And it ended up influencing a lot of my 2 years there. So Eric Kendall is a neurologist, and he talks a lot about bottom-up versus top-down processing. So what we see in our brains is actually much more complicated than the information that we get from our eyes. In perception, bottom-up processing involves the light coming into your eye and hitting the rods and cones in your retina, and then being translated into electrical signals, which get carried by your optic nerve to the visual cortex. But then Top-down processing involves making meaning by reassembling this information and putting it into context based on prior memory and experience. And that happens in like multiple parts of your brain. And this really connected to what I know about teaching, because we assimilate new information by linking it to the things that we already know. So I just kept like, like coming back to those ideas. This is a painting that I painted as I was watching my kids learn how to read. And it's sort of similar in that like the alphabet chart is linking these abstract symbols, these things that we call letters, into sounds. And then the sounds are being associated with things that my kids already knew. So, that round shape sounds like ah, which is connected to an apple. And so it is like sort of thinking about like, how do we form those neural pathways based on using prior knowledge. In my MFA, I started out working really literally with like sieves. There's that sieve on the colander thing on the left, as symbols of like this mental sifting and filtering process. In our brains, the prefrontal cortex, which is this area right in here in the front of your head, acts as a dynamic filter. So it really selects which information gets in, it chooses how it's processed, it inhibits competing information, which could act as white noise. So the sieve is sort of like a gatekeeper to what we notice. I was very interested in these filters and how they like simultaneously like protect me and isolate me. And sometimes my filter gets set too tightly, and that discarded information kind of builds up waiting to be acknowledged. I also tried painting like neural pathways more literally. So I was thinking about like, parts of neurons, dendrites and axon terminals and synapses. And, the more you practice a particular neural pathway, you're building a skill, the stronger those connections become. So I was sort of thinking about like the space between those various stepping stones and, how they could be farther apart or closer with practice. I went back to my like former process of like sculpting and drawing. So I made these little neural relays by cutting up egg cartons and drawing them. I was really looking for like a visual language to explore these ideas that were interesting to me. And this is also at the time when I started working with self-portraiture imagery in the Warpy mirror. And here's another image from that time that's in color. So this set of photos kind of shows how one of these paintings developed. This was an initial one where I was kind of looking in that warpy mirror and trying to capture aspects of myself as it shifted and changed. And then later on, I added color. And then later on, I added more color. And then just recently, I went back and added sort of like that top layer of patterning and line. And then there's another one where it's like, oh, the marks seem to represent like transmitting and receiving between these two sets of figures and the phones. And this is an optical illusion from that same book that really interested me. So those two images up on the top are actually like exactly the same. They're just rotated 180 degrees. So, but the one on the left, I think because our bodies are so used to living in gravity, we interpret that as a divot, and the one on the right, we interpret as a bump. So like, again, just sort of an example of like how our like top-down processing influences how we see. And then the image below is me just kind of looking for inspiration for like how people use color to create those sense of ripples. Okay, so after finishing up my MFA, I went back to work at Lewis and Clark College, training graduate students who are becoming middle school or high school art teachers. And I really love this job, and I've had it for about the last 10 years. And I just wanted to share a few of the things that my students practice as they become art teachers. So one of the first things is knowing your students, knowing who they are and what they care about, And that helps you find the links between what they care about and the content that you're trying to teach them, the things that you want them to learn. We also look at stages of development. This comes from Victor Lowenfeld, who talks about, like common stages of artistic development in kids, which starts off with a scribble stage, which I actually don't have a picture of, but then it kind of moves into this pre-schematic stage, which is moving from scribbles into like representations of thinking. So like sometimes people are represented as just like a head with feet, and it's all based on like what the child knows or perceives the most. And then you move into the schematic stage where the schema is a symbol or a concept that the child has developed. So, this one is definitely like an idea of like a family eating dinner. And then, but it's like, really not really a sense of perspective. Like, it's just more sort of like, this is how I'm going to represent this. And then moving into emerging realism, where the drawings get a little more specific with more details. And then eventually moving into this more sort of pseudo-naturalistic stage. And Lowenfeld talks about how this is sometimes the point where kids stop making art spontaneously and they start to become more judgmental and critical of their work. And so one of the things that we do is like talk a lot about like representationalism is not the only viable artistic intent for making art. So helping kids think about more about like less about defining is it good based on is it realistic, but like other notions of like, well, maybe your intent is to be more representative, to be more formal or more expressive, or your intent is to make art for social change, and then like all of those are like as valuable as this sort of like naturalistic drawing skill. We do a lot of work with unit planning. So the idea that units have big ideas and essential questions in the center, which I think also has informed my art making a lot, that I tend to work with these big ideas and then try out different things. I'm going to give you just a few examples from a surreal interior lesson that I used to do with students at Hillsborough High School, but also I use it as a sample with my graduate students. So big ideas are universal concepts that have enduring relevance that are really at the heart of what you're teaching. So for example, surrealism was highly influenced by developments in psychology, particularly from Freud and Jung, and surrealists tried to access the unconscious in their work. And then essential questions are more open-ended. They don't have a right answer. They're meant to be investigated, argued, looked at from different points of view. They encourage active meaning making by the learner about important ideas. So one example of that would be like, how can art help us envision the world differently? So then once you sort of have a big idea and essential question, then you craft a unit by finding cultural exemplars that relate to that, figuring out what design technique concepts and skills and techniques you want your students to learn, what are the historical and cultural contexts that you want them to understand, and also what are some of the brainstorming activities. Usually middle school and high school students don't have a lot of experience looking and talking about art. So if you're a teacher, you have to like teach students how to do that. So, we have a method of like getting students to describe what they see and then to analyze it. How are the elements and principles of design working? What's the artist doing to create an illusion of space on a flat surface? And then to interpret it, like, what do we think the message is in this artwork? What evidence do we see? What are we looking at that make us think that maybe the artist is trying to do this? And then finally, we evaluate it, which is not so much like, is this piece of art good or bad, but like, what do we think the artist's intent is, and how well do we think that artist met that intent? And then, kind of back to unit planning, whatever, every unit has its own like set of skills. So in this one, it might be elements and principles of design. This is Rob Gonzalez, who is playing with perspective in kind of interesting ways, with like a 1-point perspective that goes back to, a vanishing point at the top, but also like 3-point perspective that's going down to a vanishing point below the page. And also color theory might be part of this unit. Like the idea that colors get modified to change their hue and value and intensity. And then usually I have a lesson where students kind of think about the cultural context of the artwork. In this case, it's looking at artists who use their artwork to promote social change. And that's typically structured as a jigsaw lesson where each table group gets a different artist. They learn about their artist, they present their artist to the class as a whole, and then there's like a set of questions to help people kind of like process the ideas. And then students make art. These are examples from when I taught high school. So oh wait, I missed the brainstorming, sorry. Then there's a brainstorming lesson. In this case, it's looking at the artwork by Chris Van Allsburg in his book, The Mysteries of Harris Burdick. And I had kids write about 5 things that they care about, 5 concerns that they have about the world. And then we read Pablo Neruda's poem, A Book of Questions. And then they used those kind of like surreal expressionist questions to write their own questions that started with what if. And then they were ready to make art. So these were high school ones. What if Father Time had a bedroom? What if volleyball, not money, ruled the world? And you can see they're kind of like learning perspective and, you know, learning skill around color, all those kinds of things. I thought I would talk just a little bit about artists who inspire me. One of them is Santiago Ramon y Cajal. He's sort of known as like the father of neurology. He was Spanish. And he's one of the first people to draw neurons. So he used this like chrome silver staining method that had been developed by someone else, Golgi, in his time, to trace out whole neurons and start to classify their parts. So the dendrite, where the electrical signal is received, the axon that carries it through to the cell body, and then out the axon terminal. And he discovered that each neuron is separate with a synapse between them. So he's considered the founder of modern neuroscience. And I just think his drawings are super beautiful. This is kind of similar. This is contemporary research by Thomas Dearnick and Mark Ellsman, and they are looking at the cerebellum, which is in the back of your brain that influences motor control. And they've genetically engineered mouse brains so that different neurons are receptive to different kinds of light. So they turn, like under different kinds of light, they turn different colors, and then they're able to use that to photograph these neural pathways. This is Deborah Aschheim, who's a Los Angeles installation artist who builds electronic neurological systems. And she works on the series of installation that address the question, like, if buildings had a nervous system, what would it look like? So she uses consumer electronics like motion sensors, baby monitors, televisions to create systems that can see and hear and remember. She has a family history of Alzheimer's, and so she's built a series of devices that will feed her back memories through song in case she loses her linguistic neural pathways. This is Chuck Close, who obviously has had a big influence on me in terms of how can it be a face, but also a pattern. And because of the incredible control around value and color with abstraction. And this is Bridget Riley, who's also had a big influence with me in terms of the way that she uses line to create a sense of movement and pattern. And this is Janet Fish, who's a more of a representational painter, but also I just love her mark making, and sometimes the way the mark making sort of is more important than the image, and other times where it sort of goes back. So in conclusion, I think my idea is that art can express cohesiveness, but it can also express fragmentation. And so as I go through my day, shifting through the multiple institutions and the roles of the parent and artist and teacher and consumer and critic, I don't always feel like a unified self. I feel more like the paintings look, with multiple distorted fragments going in circles. And, you know, I'm glad I captured that because that is like part of my experience of living. And I'm starting to believe that this tension between like acknowledging fragmentation and wanting to create cohesion is part of what drives learning. So, you know, we take what we know and we try to organize it into patterns and paradigms that will help us make sense of future encounters. And as long as this works, we live in our paradigms and ignore the irregularities. But if we choose to acknowledge the irregularities and we try to make room for them, then our mental structures sometimes need to shift to accommodate the new information. And it's messy and sometimes uncomfortable, but that is what I think learning looks like. So I'm going to turn off my screen for questions, but I did want to show you that my contact information if you want to reach me. I'm on the web at the Graduate School of Education, and there's my email, and I'm also on Instagram at amyturnbullart.com. Okay, questions? Grant, I don't know if I'll be able to hear people, but maybe if they have questions, you could like say them for them.
That's what I'll do. Yeah. If
Okay.
anybody has any questions, I'll just repeat them up here
Okay.
so that everybody can hear. So let's see. Go ahead.
When it comes to like representing like how I guess fractal life is to her, like does each I guess strip have like does she go through her own emotion, like a different emotion when she's laying down each like the overlayer? Does that make some sense?
I think so. Yeah. So the question is when it comes to representing the fractal perception of your life and experience, do you have particular emotions that you're thinking about when you're laying down each strip of layered meaning? Does that sound close?
Yeah, or does it become more like just kind of like a flow? Is it more, or is it more like what is it called?
Like intuition?
Yeah.
Or is it more intuitive and kind of more like a flow of just working?
Gosh, I would say it's both of those. So sometimes I'm like looking at a photograph and I'm trying to just like sort of get the gist of like what's the value, what's the color. And sometimes the color scheme itself will start to suggest like more of a mood or emotion. And then sometimes there's just like a lot of energy in that mark making where it's like, oh, I'm using a palette knife and the paint's really thick and I'm like scratching. And so that part of it is sometimes kind of like more emotional. So I don't know that it's like completely predictable, but there are aspects that are more like expressive in my body, and there are aspects that are more sort of like controlled.
Thank you.
Anybody else? I have one for you.
Yeah.
So first of all, thank you so much. Michelle, let's do one of these. Yeah. All right. So that was a really like generous artist talk. I mean, you gave us like a ton of information about where your ideas come from and the long growth of your work as an artist and as a person and as a student. You come to art from a different background. Anyways, I just really appreciated that. I think our students really, it's valuable to hear, like something that we talk about a lot is everybody kind of comes to this from a different place.
Right.
And so thank you for that sharing. Today this is painting one, and today we really started talking about basic color theory. And so we went into some color schemes right before your talk started. And I noticed that, particularly your new work, there seem to be some really coherent strategies around color and color organization. So I wondered if you could just talk a little bit about some of your color strategies in terms of what you're thinking about when you're deciding how to lay in color.
Absolutely. Let me share my screen for that because I think it might be helpful to look at a couple of pieces of work. Oopsie, that's not it. Okay, I'm going to stop my share and first find my talk, which I must have closed down. Okay. Let's see. All right. So, well, I'll just pull up a few of these. Okay, this one, for example, you know, has an analogous color scheme. So it really ranges from yellow, green into blue. And then it's got a little bit of orange, which doesn't entirely fit. So but it's primarily analogous. And then it has value contrast. So that would be monochromatic, in that like within the greens or the oranges, I am making tints, and I'm not really making shades because I don't really have areas where I'm making blacks, but I am making a lot of tints by adding white, and I'm looking at the value on the painting that was there already and trying to change that value, like make the tint so that the value of the green that I'm putting down is kind of similar to the value of that part of my photograph, or I'm making it more neutral, like in these areas of these kind of like arching shapes that come in. So I'm adding a lot of like the complement color there to make it distinctive. So I have like almost these layers of like, oh, well, here's a row of tints, and then here's a row of like complementary colors. And then over here in the green in the middle, you know, I've got like, here's a row of tints of greens, and then not so much complementary colors there, but like, how can I go more on the analogous color scheme, like into the blues? So it's not straight up like, you know, monochromatic, analogous, complementary. It's a little bit of all of them, but it's also not like completely any color at all. Like I'm still looking for unity. And if I just look at like another one.
That's super, super helpful. I hear
Yeah.
from lots of people, like I have us muted so we're not like disrupting your talk, but everybody's going, oh, so it's perfect. It's great.
That's great because, you know, it like in some of my other ones, they are less, like in the earlier ones, they're less unified. And I think as I got more practice in this method, I did start to think about more about like, how am I going to use color to simultaneously portray a face and ripples? And so, you know, this one also, you know, mostly analogous in that it's like blues, purples, greens, some reds, so it's not completely, and then controlling the value, especially on these blue ripples, like tints on one side of the ripple, and then darker colors like the blues and purples, but not so much neutralized in those center areas. Whereas like if you look down here in this bottom ripple near the hand, you know, it's very much tints on one side of the spiral, but then again, it's like neutralized colors to create that sense of shade on the other one. And kind of the same here, although this one is a little bit more blocky. But I am creating sort of like these darker reds. And I think when I did those, trying to remember what I added to those reds. I think I used like sort of like obviously some light cadmiums for the spirals on the right side, and then it was like dark cadmiums plus blues and purples for the spirals on the left. So
Thank you so much.
sure.
That's really, really great.
Gonna stop.
One question.
Sure, Danny.
In your life experience, when it comes to displaying your art, what has been most helpful for you in finding places to get a spot to display your art?
Did you hear that?
I did hear that. This is an area where I have been extremely slow. So, you know, I did my MFA show. I am an introvert. I find it kind of like stressful to put my art out there. And then it took me, like when I did my MFA, I felt like I had the vocabulary and the ideas, but I didn't really have like the artwork that matched it yet. Like I had this vision of what I was going for, but I didn't really actually have the actual technique and styles. And so, you know, then I got a teaching job. And so it was like, okay, I didn't really have to show. I was putting a lot of energy into teaching, and I actually have spent like almost 10 years, I guess it'll be 9 years of painting without a show. And so just recently, I reached out to Kendra. I was like, okay, I feel like I've got this now. Like, I need some help in terms of like, how do I present myself as an artist? So, I got this body of work photographed. I made a website. I learned that Blackfish Gallery was accepting members, so I applied there and was accepted, and I'll be in a new member show there in January. I joined Instagram. Yeah. So it's been like, that's probably the part that I am like, where I need the most development, is like, how to get it out there. So good question. But teaching has always been a good way for me to like build relationships with people. It's a little smaller, it's like reliable income. And now I feel like, okay, that's sort of like my next stage, is to get better at this.
Thank you.
How long does it usually take you to create like one of your pieces? That's like, being a student, there's always like a deadline. It's kind of hard to manage your time and how much you can actually get finished. So how long does it usually take you?
And so I'm sure you probably heard the bulk of that, which is how long does a piece usually take? But I also wanted to call out that you didn't mention, other than just in the slides, so I had to yell at them and tell them how big these paintings are, because that you have it listed down there, and it's this innocuous 72 by 96, and you're like, that's 6 feet by 8 feet, guys. This is a huge painting, a wall-sized painting. So the question was, how long does it take you to make, and how do you manage deadlines with all of your other responsibilities?
Right. They are really big, so they do take quite a bit of time. I spend Thursdays and Fridays in my studio. So I work Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and I like do like life chores and family stuff and errands on the weekends. So pretty much Thursdays and Fridays are my painting days. And which means that like sometimes it goes kind of slowly. Like one of these paintings can take me like 3 or 4 months.
Sure.
And when I was a student, I think that's why I couldn't figure it out during my MFA, was there was like this pressure around a deadline. It was like due, and these are kind of labor intensive and have taken time. But what I do find is that like every painting usually ends with a question, like I'll finish one and then I'll feel like, well, what if I tried this? Like, what if I tried reflecting them? Or what if I tried making ripples or whatever? And so that will often drive the next one. So I've been lucky in that, like, I really just have had this period of time to kind of like experiment, explore, that I haven't had a deadline. No one really cares what I'm working on. So, do it at your own pace. So I think that's part of kind of what's like helped me, like develop this.
I was trying to kind of explain that similar issue with my students. Have you read James Elkins' What Painting Is?
Yes.
At the very beginning of that, the intro, he talks about how what we ask, particularly of grad students, is truly impossible. Like, it's like we say, like, be a master of your craft, but also you have to make to meet a deadline and think and analyze at the same time. And those are impossible tasks. So we're saying you have 2 years to master your craft, also to be an intellectual heavyweight, and you have to do those simultaneously. In a process, painting particularly, that would have at any other era in history taken 25 years to do, and we're like, nope, you get 1 year, and I feel the same way when I'm, throwing these guys into like this week is like, now learn color this week, and it's just, it's insane. So yeah, that's a good question.
Yeah, no, I think it's a great question, because sometimes it just takes your body longer to like figure it out than it does, like, at least for me, like my mind will figure it out faster than my body can actually do it. And so it's like you have to like be patient and know that you can like come back to these things again later. This isn't your only shot.
Yeah, I think that's all of our questions.
Okay.
Wait, I have one.
Oh, we got one.
Does she like her artwork?
Oh, do you like your artwork?
That's such a good question.
And a tough one.
Yes and no. I am always super interested in it. I don't always want to hang it up in my living room. And so, you know, I have like other things that I do too that seem prettier, but like I do keep coming back to these things that are like a little bit uncomfortable. So so yeah, it's sort of a mixed bag. I'm proud of it. I don't always love it.
Well said.
Yeah. All right, you guys. Well, thank you so much for having me. I
Really appreciate it.
get to talk
Thank
to
you,
you
Amy.
today.
It's great
Yeah.
to meet you.
Thank
Yeah.
you so much, Amy. I really appreciate it. That was wonderful.
You bet. Take care. And if you want to reach out to me, I'm available for questions anytime.
So thank you so much,
And I
Amy.
put I put a bunch of links in the chat too.
Yeah.
so-
Oh, great. Okay.
Thank you, Kendra.
All right. And you can come to my show in January. Bye.
Blackfish. Okay.
Blackfish. Yep.